Software piracy is widely viewed as unethical, but in certain contexts, such as limited access to expensive software in education or developing countries, some argue it may be justifiable. However, this practice carries serious risks to the cybersecurity, as pirated software often contains malware designed to exploit unsuspecting users. In my IT ethical campaign against software piracy, I emphasized three hidden costs, and one of it is the cybersecurity risk, who can impact both individuals and organizations. To gain a broader understanding of how ethical reasoning values and varies across cultures and ethical traditions, we interviewed 10 individuals from different backgrounds, asking if you were in the position of those who lack the privilege to access educational software or doesn't have the means to buy a legitimate copy, would you install a cracked or pirated version? If so, why? If not, what would be your reasoning?
Um, Ultimately, the decision would depend on specific circumstances, balancing, ethical considerations, risks, practical needs. Uh, of course, seeking legitimate solutions first would be my first option, would be my priority. But I understand that why some people may resort to piracy out of necessity in dire situations like this. But for me, piracy undermines the intellectual property rights of developers and companies who have invested time and resources in creating the software. So, supporting piracy could discourage innovation and perpetuate harm to the software industry. And I am also aware that cracked software often comes bundled with, malware, viruses, posing significant risks to personal data and devices. This risk could outweigh any potential benefits that piracy could give to me. Um, I think I would explore legitimate options such as free or open source alternatives or program offerings such as educational discounts. I think many software companies provide access to students or institutions in developing countries such as Philippines at reduced rates. So, in conclusion, I think I would, as much as possible, I would try to avoid pirated software, but I think, other people may be open to use some.
If I lack the resource to purchase or obtain access to educational materials, I would still choose not to use pirated or cracked software as several factors to consider. First off, and what I consider the most important is actually legality. So if we choose to use pirated materials, we're basically disobeying the laws. There are laws that govern and are imposed to safeguard both creators or developers of the original software and us, possible users. Next would be security risk. So, as we all know, pirated softwares have no guarantee on whether they are safe to use in the first place. There will be cases where these pirated softwares would introduce the malwares and could damage the integrity of the platform or even expose vulnerabilities to our system. Another factor to consider is the future impacts. So this impacts actually includes on how updated the software is, or how will it be supported in the future, or will it still even be compatible with the latest trends that are being used. And finally, it's actually more of a personal reason. It's actually the credibility of the person. So, as a professional working in the IT industry, it is usually frowned upon or considered unethical to be using illegal software, especially when conducting business. So, just to sum up my response, I would choose not to use pirated software due to the mentioned factors. However, I would still look into the alternatives, such as freewares, which are usually offered as demo or trials version of these educational softwares. So that's all.
If access to software were critical for my education or livelihood and there were no affordable or legitimate alternatives, I might consider using pirated software as a last resort. In this context, the priority would be gaining the skills or tools necessary to advance, especially if the inability to access the software could perpetuate inequality. While piracy violates intellectual property laws, it could be argued that in cases where companies fail to provide affordable access to essential tools for marginalized groups, piracy might be an act of necessity rather than a desire to steal. I'd accept that using pirated software comes with significant risk, such as exposure to malware or legal consequences, and would try to mitigate them as much as possible.
I guess if I lack the privilege to access or own educational materials, I believe I will be alert to crack and pirate a version of the material. But before doing so, I will be researching online articles or forums that have discussions about the software. I should be aware of the risks and dangers of what I will be getting myself into, so I need to prepare myself with sufficient knowledge that may aid me when I will be using pirated materials. I will also be asking around peers and colleagues if there are free trials or versions for the software or material. Free versions may have limited capabilities as opposed to purchased ones, but if it allows me to get my job done, it wouldn't hurt me to use it. But if there are no options left, I will be opting for the cracked versions. But before downloading or using those materials, I must prepare my devices by installing antivirus softwares and such.
Well, if I were in a position where I didn't have an access to the resources needed to purchase a legitimate copy of educational software, I'd have to weigh my options carefully. Personally, I always prefer to obtain legitimate software because it's not only the ethical thing to do but also safer, as pirated versions often come with significant risk, like malware or compromised security. Supporting the creators of the software is also important because it helps them continue developing and improving their products. However, I also understand that life doesn't always give us the luxury of time or resources. If the needed was truly urgent, say for an important project or a critical learning opportunity, and I had no other legitimate alternatives, I might consider using pirated version as a last resort. I do so know it's not ideal and being fully aware of the risk and ethical implications involved. That said, I'd make it a point to transition to a legitimate version as soon as I could out of respect for the law and the value of the work that went into creating the software.
If we are talking about education, then I would not install a cracked version of the software because if that certain paid software is part of the per se curriculum, then I think that the school should provide legitimate copies of the said software to everyone requiring it for their studies. One other thing about cracked software is that we cannot guarantee that the files aren't modified to include malware. As you said, it poses cybersecurity risks and those malwares can potentially infect your device and possibly steal data if we're not careful enough. Um, but I'm 90% sure that most of the well-known paid softwares have free alternatives like Google Docs and Sheets for Microsoft Word and Excel, or GIMP replacing Photoshop. So, yeah, I would not install cracked versions of or pirated versions of a software?
For me, yes, I would install pirated versions for educational software. It may be illegal and unethical, but it's much more practical, especially for students or those who don't have enough budget to pay for overpriced softwares. There are alternatives to switch with for free to avoid illegal practice. However, there are some instances that these paid softwares are the ones required for some users, and sometimes it's better to choose reasonable options rather than to pay a lot for a single software.
I were in a state of being unable to afford educational software, I might consider utilizing a cracked or pirated publication, if only for educational purpose. In my opinion, the idea for this is to guarantee the fact that I am able on finishing any projects or studies that require certain software. I would still be aware of possible risks such as virus cy- exposure or cyber security concerns and would try on reducing them by relying on reliable sources or looking for free alternatives. It would be solely for the sake of my education, ensuring access to tools that can help me learn, with the ultimate goal of using it contribute positively to the society. My choice would be driven just by need for access to those kind of resources while still balancing the risk involved.
Each individual approaches the ethical dilemma I gave of software piracy through distinct moral frameworks, highlighting diverse perspectives shaped by personal values and societal considerations. For deontological ethics, we have Margot and Ian. Margot and Ian emphasize strict adherence to the rules and moral duties. They believe respecting intellectual property and legal standards is essential, regardless of the circumstance. For them, ethical behavior stems from fulfilling obligations, ensuring societal order, and upholding professional integrity. For utilitarian ethics, we have Max, Davy, and Latrell. They took a consequence driven approach, justifying piracy when it serves a greater societal good, such as access to education or reducing inequality. They balance ethical concerns with practical needs, emphasizing that actions are morally acceptable if they maximize overall well being. For virtue ethics, we have Echo. He emphasized moral character and integrity, advocating for ethical choices rooted in virtues like honesty, responsibility, and respect. Even in the challenging situation, he prioritized transitioning to legitimate solutions, reflecting a long term commitment to ethical growth. For fairness and justice, we have Elijah, whom advocates for equity and institutional responsibility, arguing that ethical behavior involves ensuring equal access to resources. He believes institutions should address systematic inequalities, promoting fairness in educational opportunities. As for Kiel, he adopts a context dependent perspective, adjusting ethical decisions based on situational needs. He acknowledges the risks but remains pragmatic, showing that morality can be flexible and shaped by circumstance when legitimate options are limited. These perspectives demonstrate that ethical reasoning varies widely based on principles, outcomes, virtues, and fairness or context. Together, they underscore the complexity of moral decision making and the importance of understanding diverse ethical frameworks when addressing real world dilemmas.